Welcome to American Catechism by Stab the Dragon Productions, coming to you on Monday, September 8th, 2025, from Fort Worth, Texas, where it is currently 84 degrees, a gorgeous fall day. American Catechism is all about studying American history, politics, culture, art, religion, current events, and, yes, whiskey. I have previously given 7 lessons of prolegomena explaining why and how I'm doing this study. But tonight I'm starting the first actual historical unit. My studies of American history compel me to be unashamedly Eurocentric in my approach, in that the dominant aspects of our culture and history come from Europe. Other races and cultures have certainly impacted us, so I will for sure look at Native Americans, the First Peoples, Africans, and Polynesians as we go forward. But Europeans, by far, get the majority of the background here. Tonight we begin a unit on the Vikings. Now, most people know just a little bit about the Vikings from maybe watching the Marvel series Thor or something related. One of the TV streaming series on the Vikings that's been out there for several years, or a movie. I've got a movie, The Vikings, starring Kirk Douglas from back in the late 50s or early 60s, somewhere back then. And of course there's the NFL and the Minnesota Vikings football team. If that's where everybody gets their knowledge of the Vikings, then we're in trouble. A few people may have actually paid attention in high school American history, and they may have heard and remembered, if the teachers actually taught it, that the Vikings discovered America some 500 years or so, 400 years before Columbus. But then the Vikings left and they didn't stick around. So why study the Vikings in American Catechism? And that is precisely the big question we're going to study tonight. And along the way, I will be sipping on some Stauning Rye Whisky, a product of Denmark. This is a Danish rye whiskey. And who were the Danes? Their ancestors were the Vikings. So this lesson is kind of long, and I'll be splitting it into 2 sessions. Introduction. From the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 24, English Standard Version. But ships shall come from Kittim, and shall afflict Asher and Eber, and he too shall come to utter destruction. Now, this is a rather obscure verse, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Vikings directly. It does refer to probably the sea peoples, raiding the shores of the Mediterranean and afflicting the people who lived by the sea. These sea peoples ended up settling and became the Phoenicians, otherwise known as the Philistines. Or in North Africa, the sea peoples who settled became the Carthaginians. You could call them pirates. The verse does make a point that's relevant to discussing Vikings. Anyone who lives by the seashore is vulnerable to being raided by pirates, navies, marines, or Vikings. But the verse also says, he too shall come to utter destruction, possibly meaning those Philistines would ultimately be defeated by King David. So too would the barbarian pagan Vikings ultimately be defeated by the gospel of Jesus Christ and convert from their pagan ways to the Christian faith. Now, what would you say if you were asked these questions? Who was the first Christian to die in America? Or what was the name of the first Christian child born in the Americas, and who were the parents? Or when were the first Native Americans baptized into the Christian church? Now, most people would not be able to give the proper names to any of these questions, but in general, the answers would likely go something like this. Well, probably some of the crew of the first Columbus expedition died in the Caribbean, and they were from Spain and likely baptized Catholics, so they're the first Christians who died there. And then later, Virginia Dare was born in the Roanoke colony in 1587 to parents Eleanor and Ananias Dare. And they were likely baptized members of the Church of England. And the first Native American converted to Christianity we like to think of as Pocahontas. And she had been converted to Christianity after marrying John Rolfe. at Jamestown. Those are the stories that I was told in elementary school back in the 1960s. And while these would all be excellent guesses, and they all do form a wonderful part of our story in America, they would also all be the wrong answers to the questions I asked. The answers are Viking, Viking, and Viking, as you might expect in a chapter about Vikings. Details to follow over the next several months. Or how about this? Have you ever wondered how we got the names for the days of our week and what their names mean? Tuesday. What does that mean? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Norse god Tu, the god of single combat, law, and justice. How about Wednesday? It comes from the Anglo-Saxonized name for the Norse god Odin, Woden, Odin's Day, Woden's Day. And Thursday, well, this should be an easy one, Thor's Day, right? Son of Odin. How about Friday? Friday is either Freya's Day or Frigg's Day, the Norse goddesses of love and fertility, or the Queen of Asgard, Odin's wife. 1,000 years after the Vikings discovered America, and our Christian civilization, well, maybe now post-Christian, still calls the names of the week after pagan Norse gods. Anybody else find that interesting? Maybe the old Vikings left an impact on us after all. Maybe their story should be told and honored, not forgotten. But can American Christian patriots somehow profit from and rejoice in the stories of the pagan Vikings who worshiped false gods and discovered America? I think so. And we will also tell the story of how the Vikings converted to Christianity, a story that I was never told in school and was never even included in seminary and never included in the TV shows and movies, but it happened. So cheers to the Vikings. And that is a marvelous rye whiskey. Wow. So why study the Vikings as part of Americanology? Well, first of all, in about the year 1000, Leif Erikson led a Viking expedition and discovered America. So he sailed from Greenland, and he landed in what would later be called Newfoundland, where they settled for maybe just a couple of years, but they established kind of a permanent post there that they returned to off and on for many years. They made repeated trips to Newfoundland and Labrador, and perhaps even Maine or Massachusetts area for 500 years. Why? So they could get some supplies that they could not get in Greenland, like trees, wood, bog iron, venison. During these years, they had repeated encounters with the First Peoples, Native Americans. Some of those encounters were violent, and some were peaceful trading encounters. Secondly, the stories of this settlement in Newfoundland and these voyages were preserved in Iceland in both oral and written form here. The sagas of the Icelanders. Sailors, fishermen, and merchants from England and the rest of Western Europe probably heard some of these stories, including one each Christopher Columbus, who in fact, as a young man, sailed to Iceland at least once, about the year 1777. You think maybe hanging out in some pub in Iceland, he heard the stories? Possibly. The sagas of the Icelanders and the stories behind them are a part of our story and body of literature as descendants of Western civilization. So, third reason for studying Vikings is this is our story. This is our literature. It helped make us into who we are today. The sagas are our heritage, and if we don't preserve our heritage, If we are cut off from our past, we become rootless, impoverished culturally, and can easily be led astray by the machine, which partly explains the sad state of our culture today. Now, I admit, fourthly, that the Viking discovery of America was somewhat of a dead end in that the Vikings had little to no influence on the actual founding of America. However, in present-day American culture, our Viking past has been emphasized in pop culture in a variety of ways. Everything from comics and the newspapers, Hagar the Horrible, comic books, Thor, the movies in Hollywood, Thor, and TV in America, Canada, and Britain, where Viking series, there's been a couple of those. And there's long been an American football team called the Minnesota Vikings. The fascination with Vikings in our culture may be more than just a passing temporary entertainment fad, but may actually point to a longing for our cultural and historical roots. And this longing has not been matched by an inclusion in the history books for our students. The Vikings were certainly violent barbarians, but also masters of trading, exploring, innovation, and a degree of that ethos shows up in our American culture. Fifthly, the interactions between the Vikings, English, Irish, Scots, and French helped develop our language, customs, culture, and faith. Physically, the intermingling of bloodlines is with us still in our DNA. The Vikings are our ancestors, without whom we would be a different people. My own family has got Irish, English, Scottish, Scandinavian, and German blood coming primarily from the ancient Yorkshire region of northeastern Scotland or northeastern England, right on the border with Scotland, which was ruled by the Vikings for a couple of hundred years. So I feel like I've got Vikings in my blood. Sixth, in the early 17th century, the Swedes, direct descendants of the Vikings, founded a colony in what is Delaware today. Through immigration, largely in the 19th century, about 10% of Americans today are direct descendants from the Scandinavian peoples. That's, and that's the direct descendants. You got people, lots of people like me that have a little bit of Scandinavian in the bloodline. So if you've got Irish, English, or Scottish bloodline, then chances are you've been intermingled with some Scandinavian as well. Seventh, America and Scandinavians are still interacting in important ways, as the current war between Russia and Ukraine has led Sweden, as well as Finland, to seek membership in NATO. And the value of our other Nordic allies, Norway and Denmark, and Greenland is ruled by Denmark, and Iceland, that relationship has been enhanced because of what the Russians have been doing. And of course, we all know that in the last year, President Donald Trump is making a bid for obtaining Greenland from Denmark. Cheers to Greenland. I hope to have some walrus steak by the time this is over. During the Viking Age, the Scandinavians converted from paganism to Christianity and entered Christendom. I've got about three or four different books that talk about this conversion process that I was never taught in high school or college, seminary, but it's there. The story of conversion, I think, is important to Christians in America today for understanding how God works in history. It adds to our story of faith and goes counter to the atheistic narrative we hear so much of today. The conversion of the Vikings is not widely known. It certainly wasn't taught, and so it needs to be examined and proclaimed today in church. Ninth, much of our language and even part of our legal system comes from our Nordic past. Now, I've listed 9 reasons for studying the Vikings, yet most American history survey books include very little or nothing at all about the Vikings. In an earlier video, I discussed the question about when to begin our study of American history. What should be our starting point? And I presented several options that have been used by different authors. So now I want to briefly survey some American history texts to see how different authors from different time periods handled the Vikings. So first of all, the most recent book from Jill Lepore, These Truths. The index has no reference at all to Vikings, Scandinavians, Leif Erikson, or Greenland. Her introduction starts with a story from 1787, and her first chapter does go back to Christopher Columbus. The book focuses on the political and cultural developments of the United States, so it seems the Vikings were not relevant to her goals. The Vikings, in her opinion, did not contribute to the founding of the United States. Leaving out the Viking story is a fair option if you're focusing more on the political development of our country. Now, Lepore's book is beautifully written. She is a master of the English language. I mean, this is good, great reading. It's a delight to read. But it is a little bit left of center for my taste, but it's still doable. I mean, I would recommend anybody to read Jill Lepore's book. This is really greatness. Freedom Just Around the Corner, A New American History, 1585 to 1828, by Walter McDougall. Similarly, he has no mention of the Vikings. In fact, McDougall does not really even deal much with the discovery of America by Columbus. He does give a very nice European background to why and how the English settled America, but only as a lead into the history of the colonies, which would become the United States. McDougall does a wonderful job of stressing our English roots and culture, but his main theme seems to be that America is a nation built by hustlers, those with a scheme for getting rich. This makes an obvious tie-in for me with Eric the Red, though, Leif Erikson's father, who named Greenland Greenland in order to convince people from Iceland to move to his colony. But McDougall didn't include that story either. While this book is certainly not left of center, neither is he a cheerful rah-rah conservative who thinks America can do no wrong. The stories of the Vikings simply don't fit his purposes either. Then we have Bill Bennett's book, and this is a two-volume book, or two-volume story, America, the Last Best Hope, Volume 1, From the Age of Discovery to a World at War. He doesn't mention the Vikings or Scandinavians or Leif Erikson either. And he also begins his book by looking back to Europe in the Age of Discovery, especially Portugal, and the efforts of Prince Henry the Navigator. And that's well done. Bennett is a well-known conservative, and his book focuses on showing the virtues of American history and is intended to revive pride in our country. And this is a popular book that would be suitable probably for high school students in private or religious schools, or certainly with the homeschool crowd, but not so much for college. This book was a pleasure and joy to read, but would need to be paired with a more critical book for more critical work. So it is a little bit on the rah-rah conservative side, which is, fine. Just needs some other accompanying reading. Now, mercifully, Howard Zinn also does not include any reference to the Vikings in his best-selling, communist-leaning A People's History of the United States. He starts with Columbus and focuses on all the atrocities of the Spanish. I can only imagine what Zinn would do in writing about a bunch of white, bloodthirsty Vikings. Ugh. I do not recommend Zinn, unless you're doing what I'm doing, a survey of American history. Next, we've got A Patriot's History. Patriot's History of the United States. From Columbus's Great Discovery to the War on Terror by Larry Schweikert and Michael Allen. And here I want to read a long quote. God, glory, and gold, not necessarily in that order, took post-Renaissance Europeans to parts of the globe they had never before seen. The opportunity to gain materially while bringing the gospel to non-Christians offered powerful incentives to explorers from Portugal, Spain, England, and France to embark on dangerous voyages of discovery in the 1400s. Certainly they were not the first to sail to the Western Hemisphere. Norse sailors reached the coasts of Iceland in 874 and Greenland a century later, and legends recorded Leif Erikson's establishment of a colony in Vinland, somewhere on the northern Canadian coast. Whatever the fate of Vinland, its historical impact was minimal, and significant voyages of discovery did not occur for more than 500 years. Now, I really appreciate what Schweikert and Allen say here and how they say it. The brief sentence links the Norse to those who followed later and gives some of the progress of the Norse going from Iceland to Greenland to Canada. But I have a complaint. It's that they cited a source for this that dates back to 1906 and seems to leave it in the legend category, when the archaeological dig at Lands off Meadows took place in the 1960s and is very well documented. So they didn't get the sources that they needed for that. Now, at this point, we've been going for quite a while, and so I'm going to pause and we'll pick up where I left off on the next Viking show in 2 or 3 weeks. So, cheers to the Vikings. This is Stab the Dragon Productions, in hoc signo vinces, out here.